Excellent. And with that, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Cindy Bergvall. Cindy's goal is for people to see the power of their numbers to advance their organizations. Cindy is a director with the accounting firm of B. Bergvall and Company and a strategic consultant with the Catalyst Center for Nonprofit Management. Cindy has served on a number of boards, and she is adjunct faculty at the Cairn University Nonprofit Leadership Graduate Program. And with that, Cindy, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session. Our goal over the next hour is to discuss the following. We want to think about how we can interpret the data that we're collecting, and in the process, you might determine that there's data that you have that you want to focus on collecting. We're going to look at how you evaluate what actions will give you the best results. How can you stay on track with your plan? And then we want to take a look at dashboards and understand why they are valuable to our organization as far as tracking action, progress, results, and to empower and engage our team. And we will wrap up our presentation with understanding the role of the key performance indicators. You will recognize that as we go through this course, we're actually going to be talking about key performance indicators as we go along, but we're going to go over them in the form of examples first and then dive a little deeper. So we are not, because this is a webinar, we're not going to take some time to do this exercise, but this is something that you can do in groups to kick off a strategic planning conversation or with your department heads from time to time, or even with your boards. So picture this, it's 5 years from now. You're sitting on an airplane, and you hear two people behind you talking about your organization. What do you want to hear them saying? A couple things to think about is sometimes when we do vision, especially because of the BHAG, the Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal that was made popular, I believe, by Good to Great, we have this feeling that we have to have something very exciting, Instagram-worthy, something that will take the world by storm. Your organizations are doing wonderful work, and you're serving people, and you're keeping them housed. If your organization is around 10 years from now doing the same wonderful work, that is a worthy vision. It does not necessarily have to mean that you've doubled in size or that you're serving more people or that you've made some great strides in what you're doing. That's perfectly fine if that is your vision and your goal, but sustainability is not easy, and to be around 10 years from now is something that is an important goal to have. So I want you to keep in mind, should you do this exercise with your team, bigger is not always better. Sometimes it is better to go deep with your current clients and serve your current clients well and deeply, or you might decide we want to go broad, we want to serve more clients and do a lot of different things with a lot of different people, or you might decide on a hybrid mix. Some of this will come to light as we look at these examples and you think about, how do we decide we want to best use our time? When we think about data, oftentimes we think about, this is math. I don't like math, so therefore I don't want to work with data. My board doesn't understand data. The people that I work with don't understand. This is just too big of a mountain to cover. So we want to think about this in terms of a story. So we are in this story, though, we're going to be both the role of the reader and the role of the author. So when we think about the reader, we are going to be reading the data and we're thinking about what is the story the numbers are telling us. For me personally, I like math, so numbers tell me a story. While that doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody, there are things that you can learn when you look at numbers, so the numbers will tell you a story whether you like math or not. So we're going to look at trends, and trends are looking at several years or several months in a row and saying, what are the trends we are seeing? What is the story behind the numbers? We're also going to look at ratios. So think of ratios, and I'll go over what ratios are shortly. Think of ratios as context clues. Ratios give us a clue. And they also, just like trends do, they tell us where we've been and where we are headed. So when you look at numbers, numbers can also predict what could happen in the future based on the trends that you're looking at. You can make conclusions about the direction that you're going based on where you've been in the past. And then drill down. So oftentimes, you hear a story. Sometimes your clients have stories. Your clients will tell you a story. This is why I have trouble finding housing. Oftentimes, you peel back the layers of the onion, and it's rather complex. It's not so simple. You have to drill down. So we have to think about what's going on under the surface. Why are we seeing this story? Why are the numbers acting this way? This, as we will see from our examples, is not always an easy process. So let's get started. We're going to work through 3 different examples to illustrate these points, and then we will circle back and talk about the principles behind these examples. So a common metric used in housing, I do realize that some of you are coming at housing from different angles, so this might not be an applicable metric to your organization. However, for organizations that are helping people find housing, they may use this metric. How long does it take us on average to find somebody housing? So this part of the example is fictitious, but in our fictitious example, this organization, if you see these years, the way they're phrased is 2014 to 2015, many nonprofit organizations have a year end of June 30th. So when we're looking at, the year end, so in this example, this is July 1st, 2012 to June 30th, 2013. So the way that they're showing this is all June 30th, 13, June 30th, 14, June 30th, 15. So if you were to look at this trend, if we were a live audience, I would ask you to tell me what we're concluding. But the question that is on the table is this trend good or bad? So in 2013, it took us on average 70 days, 2014, 80 days, and in 2015, let's pretend we're at the end of 2015, now it's taking 87 days. So is this trend good or bad? Feel free, you can type it in if I ask any questions, and you can type quickly before I go on to the next one. But basically, this trend is bad. It is taking us longer over the years to help our folks find housing. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to figure out why. Why is it taking us longer to find housing than it used to be? Some of this why could be a brainstorming session with your team. It might be things that you already know. Perhaps some of the reasons why this has happened is that there's things outside of your control. But you want to identify what do you have within your control. You also want to think about what's going on under the surface. Is there other data underneath these numbers that we can look at as well? So what are the factors that lead it to take longer to find housing? And if we look at those factors, and those factors be measured, and if that's the case, are there any conclusions that we can make when we measure those factors? So right now, those of you this is your world, you're probably thinking about certain factors that lead it to become more difficult for you to find housing. In this fictitious world, for purposes of our example, we have made up some factors. So let's just say for our fictitious example that you have a volunteer network, and the volunteer network has enabled you to find housing. So this volunteer network, when you look at that, you realize that the fewer volunteers that you've had in your network, that has decreased. So decrease in number of volunteers has led to an increased number of days. My apologies, I am not sure if this is your real world or not, but you can substitute anything that's applicable in your situation to this thing. The important point is we're looking at numbers. The things that are connected to influence are numbers that we saw in our results, what's behind the scenes. Let's also say that your desirable housing, because of the people that you're working with, you know that if you put them in housing that's closer to public transportation, they're going to be more likely to get their children to childcare and also get themselves to their work. And if they have work, they will be more likely to sustain housing. Likewise, if they have child care within walking distance, that will be convenient as well. So you see a correlation. You see that as these things have declined in both of these situations, that the housing has taken longer. So you decide what you're going to do. So think about the data. There's some sort of cause and effect. What does that data show? I mentioned earlier that can be very difficult to know your cause and effect. At this point, some people give up in the conversation. They say, this is too hard. We really can't see any clear correlation. Sometimes this works, sometimes that works. We don't know what to do. So then they conclude it's too hard. They stop. They do not go further. I would challenge that decision because to do nothing is not any help at all. At least you need to start and think, where do we see some correlation, and let's act on that. And until you act and decide if changing your current action is going to yield different results, and you start measuring your actions and measuring the results, you don't know for sure where your correlations are. So you have to start somewhere. So when we talk about setting goals, to some extent, the goals are somewhat of an experiment, depending on the data that you have. But you have to start somewhere. So you're going to set your goals within the context of information you already have available. If you need to and you can get more information, perhaps from the Housing Alliance or other community organizations, you can certainly go that way. But if you have limited information, you have to start somewhere. So let's say we decide that we're going to set a goal for the next 3 years. Our goal is to go from 80, 70 to 50. And you'll note that our first 2 years are not terribly ambitious. We just want to go from 87 to 80 to 70. But what we're saying is over 2 years, we expect that whatever our actions are, they're going to gain some attraction so that by year 3, we'll really get to where we want to be. It's important to recognize this. It's important for your board and your management to recognize. I realize that many of you on this call are program directors. So sometimes something that might sound really great to your board, we want to get to 50 days because 50 is our goal. As a program manager, you might say in all practicality, if we're at 87, it's going to take us 3 years before we can get to 50. So there's the ideal where you'd like to be, but the reality of how many years is it going to take to reach that goal, and what do we need to get there. So you decide it's going to take, this is the goal that you've set. This goal is going to be determined by the input of you as program managers, your management, and then informed by your board as well to the extent that they might have expertise in that situation. Once this goal is agreed upon, this is extremely helpful. We'll see this more in the dashboard section, but it's very important that everybody is working towards the same goal and that everybody is on the same page. We don't want to say something like we just want people to be housed quicker, because how are we defining quicker? How are we defining success? Is quicker just simply better than last year, or is quicker 10 more days better than the year before? And in the case of the end years, we're saying actually 20 more days better than before. So what do we decide to do? Well, we decide that these are the triggers, these are the levers that will push housing. You can substitute the levers that are applicable in your situation, and we're going to tie numbers to our levers as well. So we've decided that we're going to increase our volunteer network, increase the number of housing units near to these different things. So these are the goals that we've set. And now this is where this is certainly a nice chart. We have those goals, but we want to think about how are we going to communicate to everybody how we are doing, what does our progress to these goals look like? And this is where this chart comes into play. This chart is a format adapted by the article, A Nonprofit Dashboard and Signal Light for Boards. It's by Jan Mazzocco and Jean Bell. Some of you may have seen this before. Blue Avocado is a really well-written blog, very user-friendly. I encourage you to take a look. They spend an article discussing this chart. We are not going to discuss this quite as fully as the article does, so I really encourage you to take a look at that. But what you'll note is that it's a very clear visual picture of what you've decided to do, your target by year end, a descriptive of your target, and then here's your progress. Here we are year-to-date first quarter. Here we are year-to-date second quarter. So in our first quarter, remember we were at 87 by the end of the prior year. So our first quarter, we may have set the goal that we need to be, down to 85. And we're there, so therefore it's green. Green is good, we're on our goal. However, second quarter, no movement. We're still at 85 days on average. Therefore, this is colored yellow, meaning we're not really where we need to be. Correspondingly, we've set goals to increase the pool of housing near child care. Whatever we set for our threshold, I'll get to the thresholds and how you determine what's green, yellow, and red shortly. But we're not there. We're not green. It's not good. We're not in between. It's red. So red is basically bad. So by using these colors, very quickly, everybody from your program staff, you as program directors, your executive directors, your board, can easily see here's where we are. Now, depending on what you've decided as an organization, your board might not get a report that's quite this granular and detailed. You might just decide on one key factor. If you can imagine, if as an organization, if you have 20 different goals across the organization, your board getting charts like this for 20 different items might be overwhelming, but different departments will have more detailed charts. So this might be your detailed chart for your department, but one key factor might be shared with the board. All right, so let's talk about how do we decide red, green, and yellow. So just as we set goals, we said, these are annual goals. We're going to set quarterly goals within the year. So if we take the year ended 2016, let's say the year starts July 1st. If our goal by the end of the year is to get to 47, where do we need to be by September 30th? Where do we need to be by December 31st, our second quarter? Where do we need to be by March 31st? So you're going you want to be to 47. So where are you now? Let's say you're at 40, second quarter 42, first quarter 42, second quarter 44, third quarter 46. You get the picture. So we're going to set quarterly goals. The next thing we want to think about is what deviation from these goals is acceptable. So if your first quarter, your goal was 85, you hit 85, you're green. If your second quarter, your goal was 84, but you're still at 85, well, you're just one off. So a deviation of one is going to be yellow. So you're going to think, green is hitting the mark. We're hitting the mark or better. Yellow is somewhere in between red and green. So what you really want to do is you want to think about first, what constitutes green? Green is hitting the mark or better. Second, you want to think about what deviation would we say was bad. So is it being, 3 numbers off the mark, 5 numbers off the mark? If you're dealing with percentages, how many percentage points off the mark is red? What counts as bad? And then once you decide, this number and over is green, this number and below is red, then everything in between is going to be yellow. That's the first part of setting these colors. Oh, okay. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just saw that somebody's having trouble with the phone. Is that unique just to one person, or do I need to speak louder? Let me know. I'll keep an eye on that box. Sorry about that, guys. So the question is, we have red, yellow, and green. You've decided your threshold. The next thing that you want to think about, and this comes into play when you're deciding your threshold, is what are we going to do? So will we decide if it's red for 2 quarters in a row, we're going to change action. How do we decide when we're going to change action? Because the reality is these are your goals. If you're not meeting your goals, at what point do you change your action? So this leads us to our next situation, because behind every goal are action items. So when we think about action items, we want to think about how do we determine what our, are we reaching our goals? So your action items are these. If you were to look up something about key performance indicators, you're going to see this term leading indicators and lagging indicators. So you're going to think of lagging indicators as talking about your history. A lagging indicator will tell you what happened in the past. It tells you the history. Your leading indicators drive the future. They tell you what's going to happen in the future. So think about it as a driver. So your action measures are, these are things that we're going to do to get this end result. So at this stage, we kind of have the ultimate goal. We want to decrease the days to housing. Underneath that ultimate goal, we've developed 4 sub-goals around volunteers and public transportation and different things there. Now we're thinking about what actions are we going to take to drive those goals. So we decide, one of our goals is to get more community partners, because we realize that when we have more community partners, we are more likely to decrease the number of days it takes somebody to get housing. We recognize in the past, the more we visit people, we can get more partners. So we're going to have 10 visits a quarter. So we set our standards, if you're going to have 10 visits a quarter, what deviation away from 10 is bad? In this case, it was determined that, 5 is too low, so 5 is red. 9 isn't quite 10, it's yellow. The other thing we've decided is that we're going to identify and build relationships with new people. We want 3 new community partners, and you can see that that's green. This one, 5 touch points a quarter. Below 5 is yellow. So this color helps inform people. I've had some people say, we can't print this out at board meetings. The ink is too costly. Our board wants printed materials. They don't want emails. If that's the case, you can use a store. You can use up and down arrows. Determine what works for your organization. Somebody told me their board member was colorblind. Whatever you need to do to adapt it, but I think you get the picture of the idea that some sort of symbol or colors will quickly communicate to everybody we're on target. This is really important because your staff is working, and if you haven't clearly defined expectations and success, your staff cannot sit there and say, you know what, we're out there, we're getting community partners, yay, we're on track, we have something to celebrate. If you haven't determined that 3 is success, your staff could have had 5 partners, developed 5 partners in that quarter, and they have no frame of reference to the fact that what they're doing is contributing to the overall sustainability of your organization. So this is why when we talk about data being important, it's important on so many levels, not just for top management, but your staff to see also that they are, hitting the ground and being successful. If you find that something is red, you need to think about, why is that happening? Oftentimes, one of the reasons why is we didn't have time to visit the partners. So if that's the case, if you didn't have time to visit your community partners, well, what else are you doing that's taking up your time? And are those things that are taking up your time, are they still important? In our example, we've set certain goals. Are there things that still have to happen on a day-to-day basis that we haven't considered? So have we set realistic goals that can fit into everybody's schedule? And I do recognize that that is not an easy process. So I would encourage you, when you're setting these goals, try to incorporate things that you might already be doing that actually work. but you're just thinking, yes, we know these things work, we just need to do more of it and increase the volume so that we can move the sectors. The next chart that I'm showing, this is a picture because we talked about, what is the story that we ended up reading. In this situation, this organization was at 89 days, then down to 84. Then, look, they dropped way down to 47, and now this past year they're at 45. The rest of my example was completely fictional. This is actually a true story. This came out in a newsletter from a client of ours just, I think, last week. This is a very exciting story to tell. In preparing for this webinar, I only had time to get the end result, so this is sharing the graph. I will be circling back to them and find out what happened here. What actions did they take to show these really terrific results? And that way, the next time I present this webinar, we will have real true actions that got these results. But that is, how exciting is that if you're the staff person that's working with folks and now people are being housed pretty much, they used to be 84 days, now it's 45 days. That's very rewarding if you are part of that organization, and that's exactly the story that you want to be able to read and to tell your donors, thanks to you, this is what we're doing. So let's look at another example. We spent quite a bit of time on the first example to lay the foundation. This is somewhat similar as far as that you're looking at your trends over the years, but now we're going to introduce the concept of ratios. So here we are. We see that your housing rent has changed. It is, I apologize, the years are actually wrong. The years should be reversed. So, but over the years, you're getting more in housing rent, but your accounts receivable has also gone up. But we don't know if that's good or bad. Yes, it's good. We're getting more revenue. But by the same token, our receivables have gone up. So let's dig a little deeper. We look at receivables as a percentage of fees, and we see that over time, what people owe us, what is still left to be collected, is a larger percentage of the total rent that we're getting. So that's not good. But does that really tell the whole story? Well, let's dig a little deeper. So we did accounts receivable as a percentage of revenue. There's an accounting measure, and it's the days that it takes us on average to collect what is owed to us. So what this is saying is that 3 years ago, it took us 35 days on average to collect what was owed to us. Last year, it took 47 days. Now, it's taking over 2 months to collect what's owed to us. So this is not good because this is influencing our cash flow. Perhaps we're having trouble paying bills. Our bills are being paid late. Plus, as all of you know, if it takes longer for your folks to pay you, there's a chance you might never get paid at all. So what are we going to do? We dig in deeper. We find out what's happening. So what's going on behind the numbers? What's behind the story? Our tenants are running into financial difficulties. They're getting behind. Also, in our rent revenue, some of that's coming in as Section 8 money from the county. And we find out that the county is rejecting paperwork. So either we're not getting paid by the county or the county is taking longer to pay. Just like we talk about peeling back the layers of the onion with our clients, you're constantly asking why. So first our question was, well, why are we running into cash flow problems? We're running into cash flow problems because our accounts receivable is increasing. It's taking people longer to pay us. Why is it taking people longer to pay us? Well, our tenants are running into financial difficulty, and the county is rejecting our paperwork. So what's the next question? The next question becomes, why are our tenants running into financial difficulty? Why is the county rejecting our paperwork? So we dig deeper there, and we set our first goal. We want to reduce the days fees in accounts receivable. So instead of it taking us 62 days on average to be paid, we want it to take us 40 days. How are we going to do that? Well, we've peeled back the onion, we've peeled back the layers, we've asked our questions, and we've realized that, the county has constraints, they've had budget cuts, the same people that used to be there aren't there, they're having questions that aren't getting answered. So we recognize that if we start calling them every single week to follow up on some open items they have, to get to know the new people better, that we are going to move that along more quickly. So we determined that, the goal is that, on average, 12 weeks out of every 13 and a quarter, we're going to call the county. If we fall behind, that would be yellow. We're also going to have more conversations with our landlords. We recognize that if our landlords let certain things behind, let's say the landlords don't fix the stove or they don't, fix different things, then our renters get dissatisfied and don't pay the rent. So we recognize that we have more frequent conversations with the landlords to find out, where are the issues? Why are the tenants not paying? Is it in the landlord's hands, in the tenant's hands? Are there interactions the landlord could have with the tenant that would lead the tenant to pay more timely? And we recognize that if we have more conversations, we can get to the heart of that issue. The other thing that we realized is that attendance at our financial wellness classes has declined, and that has correlated with our tenants having financial problems. So we set the target that our tenants need to attend 80% of the classes, and we start measuring that. So you can start to see the connection between goals and action items. And oftentimes I see that organizations are very good at charting their goals, not necessarily good at charting their action items. If you look at this chart, not terribly sophisticated. Sometimes if you were to Google that dashboards, you'll see all sorts of very sophisticated, fancy pictures, and you think, how will I make those? I can't do that. I don't know how to use Excel. With this system, this is just a chart, copy, paste it, plug the numbers in. We even had a client that years ago I would go out to work on their work, and they had a large piece of butcher paper that hung from the top of the door to the bottom of the door. And their action items were on that butcher paper. The goal, the standard was written, what they had to do that month, and they tracked it in magic marker on that butcher paper. Everybody was on the same page. They saw it. They saw when they were on target. They could celebrate their successes. This does not have to be terribly complicated. So let's look at our next example. In our next situation, you're looking at different revenue streams. There could be some contributions, program service fees, in this case rent, and then special events that your nonprofit might have. You have different expenses. In our situation here, there was a profit of $50,000, then a loss of $20,000, now a loss of $35,000. So obviously over the years, things have not been looking too good. So where do we need to dig deeper? Well, we decide we're going to break this down and think about where is our money coming from. So this example was very summarized, very top level. And I recognize that if you're on, I don't think, if my memory serves correctly, I don't think that any of you on the call are in the finance department. So this is where you want to get together with your finance department, because the information that you're trying to gather, you're going to need their assistance for. However, just because I'm saying to get in touch with your finance department, this information is very, very important to you as program people. So you want to dig a little deeper, and you want to find out, for all of these categories, contributions, fees, special events, total revenues, expenses, how do we put these into buckets? We have 4 different things that we do, right? Housing, job training, etc. How is each individual bucket of services that we provide contributing to our bottom line? Your finance person can help you figure that out. So for the purposes of these conversations, how you allocate these expenses would actually be part of a different presentation. So for our time here today, let's assume that your finance person has worked with you, and we've gotten to this end result. And what you realize is that prior to your overhead costs, so like your rent and your administrative salaries and your office expenses and utilities, prior to that, we see that housing is contributing the most money to your organization, job training second, and we realize that our emergency shelter is actually draining money from the organization, and the food program to some extent the same thing. So why are we doing this? Why are we taking the time to figure this out? We want to think about how much does it cost us to deliver our services? We need to understand the cost of what we do. This is going to help in several ways. It's going to help us in making decisions. Does the cost of the program, so we identified that the emergency shelter program is actually a drain on our resources. Right now, for whatever reason, that's not the attractive program that's bringing in contributions. Can we change that? Would be something we would ask. Can we get more contributions around that? But right now, this is our reality. So we want to think about, does the money that's costing, the fact that this is draining our program, does that justify the end result? Is this program effective? And this is where kind of your subjective stories come in. The data showing the number of people that you serve comes into play. Does that justify the end result? The other thing that you want to think about is, the fact that we're providing emergency shelter to people, does the community still value that? So, if we're sheltering 50 people every night, is that still valuable to the community? Are they still supporting it? When we look at the chart that we just looked at and we see that only $10,000 was given for the emergency shelter program, that's communicating to us the community does not value this program. How do we make it more valuable to the community? We need to communicate to our donors that this is important. Is what we're doing working? So we're spending money. Are we developing desirable outcomes, and is it working? Do we have certain programs that could jeopardize the entire organization? In our example, this organization has been steadily losing money, and when we peel back the layers, we realize it's due to one or two programs. So overall, the organization doesn't have issues, but specifically to certain programs are pulling you down. Have there been changes in funding? For a number of our clients, their government grant picture looks very different now than it did 5 years ago. So government grants used to cover the cost of these programs. Now the government grant doesn't. In some cases, our clients have been able to either cut expenses, usually not cut expenses. More often than not, though, they've been able to generate additional contributions to make up for the losses in government grants. This has been either through developing special events or beginning a donor appeal program where one might not have existed before. It is not an easy road to travel, and it can take a few years to get traction to build up a donor development program if up until this point you've been dependent on government grants. However, if that's your reality and the government grant does not cover your expenses, you need to think about, if we have several programs going on and the government grant no longer covers the cost of this one program, can we keep doing this program at the expense of all the other things that we do? Is there any room to reduce expenses? A lot of people will say we just can't. Nonprofits are usually very bare bones. So then the other things to think about is somebody else already doing this. So somebody else might already be doing the same type of program. Are they able to do it cheaper? Are their outcomes stronger? When we talk about them doing cheaper, it's not necessarily that they're cutting costs that you're not cutting. I think some of you realize, it might be the same cost to serve 50 people as you can serve 10 people, just because you have to have, you need part-time staff there from the hours of 2 to 4. So if that's the case, you can't usually find somebody that will just work 2 hours a week you end up hiring somebody for 20 hours a week, that 20-hour-a-week person might be able to serve 4 people. They might be able to serve 20 people. If you don't have the volume of people, it ends up, that your per, the cost what it costs you to serve each individual might be higher than what it might cost another organization in the area to serve a larger volume of people. So these are the things that you want to think about. So in this theoretical example, you decide that you're going to reduce the number of people served in the emergency shelter. Perhaps you only operate for so many nights. You're going to increase donations and volunteer time to help eliminate the deficit in the food program. Here's our goals outlined. This is a picture very similar to the other pictures we looked at before. This is our goal. We're quantifying our target, and then here's what we have. At this point, you're probably thinking about some of your goals, and one thing that I would encourage you to do, a very kind of a quick win, if you're thinking about this process for your own organization, would be to pull out your strategic plan for your goals for the year and make sure that you have numbers assigned to your plan and numbers assigned to your goal. Again, we're trying to define what does success look like. We assign action items. If we have contacts with retirement, you recognize that in the past you've been able to get good volunteers from retirement communities, then you increase contacts over more different retirement communities, and you recognize that if you increase social media. A lot of our conversation, I've talked about action, is I've referred to, you recognize a correlation. So you say, in the past, when we've done more of this, this has happened. If you haven't measured things in the past, this is going to be hard. But until you try, you won't know. So I really encourage you, if you have not measured actions in the past, to start measuring now. We've been through several different examples. You're not necessarily going to walk away. If you're not doing this already, you're not necessarily going to walk away from this session and come up with as many measures as we've talked about. I would encourage you just to start with 1 or 2. What you're going to measure 1 or 2 things to see if this action will influence this result. It is not an easy science. So let's move on, because we're going to talk about some things that we can do that will help make this science a little easier. So we started off by saying we're going to talk about key performance indicators. So all of the examples that we've talked about have used key performance indicators. Our goals have been different key performance indicators. They are things that we decided are key, which are critical to our success. They have something to do with our performance, meaning it's something that you can influence, and it's an indicator. This is something that's going to give us information. Key performance indicators, you'll see the abbreviation KPIs. You strategize, you figure out what KPIs we're going to use, you measure, you look at the measures, do these measures make sense? You adjust or innovate where the measures don't make sense, change things up, do more of the same. It is a continual process. Unfortunately, like many things in life, it is not one and done. You are revisiting these, you are modifying these. And this is where I would encourage you to speak with others, speak with other people. I think the Housing Alliance Conference already happened, or it is coming up. So when you go to the conferences, when you meet in different groups, you're going to have these conversations. What are other measures? What are other KPIs that folks in your industry are using? Are there benchmarks? Does the Housing Alliance have standard benchmarks that they can give you? Talk to people. What correlations do others see between action and the result? There's a number of studies that you can look at that talk about if you do this, this will happen. So this is not necessarily in a vacuum. There's research-based studies, evidence-based studies. that you can look at. There's community organizations that do studies. I know in our area, the Health Spark Foundation has a safety net initiative, and they have folks that get together and talk about this in groups. So when you're trying to figure out what do we measure, what really works, you're not doing this by yourself. You're talking to people who have walked this road before you. Also talk to people who have more sophisticated measures systems. So I recognize on this call, for some of you, this might be brand new information. For others, you're on this call because you've been doing this for years, and you might have a sophisticated system, and you're just looking to pick up some tidbits along the way. Talk to other people, see what they're doing, share stories with each other, and come together to find out what KPIs really work well. And also what actions drive your results. So that brings us back to our thought, sometimes it is a continual reevaluation process to see how do things interact, what really drives, what's driving this end result. You might also find that maybe for the last 5 years, this one action already, always drove this result. You always saw a good correlation. What if this year you're running into problems because you're doing the same amount of action, but you're not getting the same result? Have things changed in your community or in the way things work that no longer is true? And that can be hard to figure out because sometimes it could be a temporary situation. So one of the things that I would encourage you when we talked about, the red, yellow, and green, to think about, how long are we comfortable being in red? Can we be in red for 2 quarters to see if this is just an isolated circumstance where our actions are no longer working? Or after 2 quarters, do we need to change up the actions? What do we need to do? Again, this is where I really encourage you to talk to others in your industry or in the nonprofit world to say, this is what we're seeing. What are you seeing before you start to change things around? But think about whenever you have measures, you want to have measures that both show your history, what happened in the past, and then you also want to have measures that you're measuring the drivers. Are we measuring our action items? When we think about dashboards, all of our examples use this dashboard, the system that the Blue Avocado designed. I present that example because it's very easy to do. You don't need any sophisticated tools. But you can also design your own dashboards based on what makes sense for your organization. The elements that you want to have is think about it's telling you things that are currently in existence and allows you to make decisions. So again, the red, there's danger, service engine soon light, that's yellow, maintenance, we're coming up, we need to work on this. So you want to make sure that whatever dashboard you pick, it has some sort of indication. In our examples, we use the red, yellow, or green, but your dashboard should be telling the users of your dashboard very easily when do we need to make decisions. If you're going along and looking at your dashboard and they're always green, you're probably not having to stop and make decisions. You will continue to go, just like as long as your car isn't giving you any warning signs, you keep going. If you go to Google Images and Google Dashboards to get ideas of types of dashboards, much to my surprise, Pinterest was a big popular warehouse of a dashboard. This dashboard from the Indianapolis Museum of Art is a really cool-looking picture. This is live on their site. I believe if you were to Google their site today, this will still come up. And because you're on a webinar, I bet half of you are Googling this right now. These counters change continuously. Obviously, the Indianapolis Museum of Art has a bigger budget than many of us. Yours does not have to be sophisticated, but there's elements of this dashboard that illustrate everything we've been talking about. So, they've just picked 9 things. Easy to read, clear format, a couple little pictures. When we look at this, we see some results. So we see results like memberships. There's 6,000 members, and there's 21,000 fans on Facebook. So one of the things that we might suppose is, is there a 1 to 3 correlation? Do we assume that for every three fans on Facebook, we're going to get 1 membership? What are we doing on Facebook to get membership? Likewise, are there other things that we're doing to drive fans to Facebook? So there's correlations between some of these metrics that are similar to the concepts that we discussed earlier. So where do we start? Let's say you haven't done this before. We want to think about the vision exercise that we did earlier. Where do we want to be 5 years from now? We want to write down where are we now, and we're going to use descriptive terms, but we also want to make sure that we tie numbers and data to that. I am always surprised at the number of strategic plans that we will see that have no numbers on them. They're very nicely written. They might have beautiful pictures. They might be written with a lot of clarity. But if you don't have a number attached to your goal, you have no idea what your board expects, what your public expects, what your executive director expects, what you as program folks, what are you shooting for? What are you driving for? So you want to make sure that there's clear numbers and data. From the stories and numbers that you read, what is behind that? Where are there correlations? And then what actions can you do more of to get the same result? We talked about setting a 5-year vision. You can say, okay, if we want to be here in 5 years, where does that mean we need to be in 3 years? And if we want to be here in 3 years, where does that mean we need to be a year from now? So it's kind of that long-term vision translated into short-term vision. There are worksheets on the next few pages. We're not going to stop and fill those out now, but basically it's just a replication of the worksheets that you looked at earlier. What to do when you're stuck, because if you are like most people, you're at this point that this sounds fabulous in a 1-hour session, but in real life this is very difficult. There's 3 different methods. The start, stop, keep method can be very helpful, especially if you're going to start doing new things that you haven't done before. So as much as new ideas are fabulous and exciting, have you heard of there's something called the shiny object syndrome, where I've never met a shiny object I don't like. I've never met a new idea I don't like. But the reality is you cannot pursue a new idea or a new action item or a new thing on your to-do list if you don't stop something you're already doing. Very few people in the nonprofit world have any type of margin. In fact, many of you are operating at negative margin. So what do you need to do less of? And this is a good conversation. And I know that a number of you are sitting there thinking there's nothing, we cannot do less of anything. If we stop doing something, horrible things will happen. There are probably many, many things that you cannot do less of. But if you're going to add something, you're going to have to find something to do less of. As we talked about from the beginning, this process does not necessarily mean that you're going to add anything. You might just decide to start measuring what you are already doing to make sure that your time is best spent. So you might very well be operating within keep. But this is a nice thing if you're doing brainstorming with your team to go through the start, stop, keep. What do we need to do? Are there things that are a waste of our time? The other thing to explore is this theory of change or logic model. I'll look at a very brief example of this. We're going to sketch out cause and effect. And then lastly, what I had suggested before, talk to people at industry seminars, look up industry and community resources. different people are getting involved in peer groups, whether that's a nonprofit mastermind group or a cohort or a community of practice. I've heard it called several different things, but where you are meeting with people who have a similar responsibility to you with your job, either monthly or quarterly, and you're sharing ideas and solutions. And I would say as a firm, we have really seen people exponentially reach their goals faster and smarter through this crowd and peer sourcing method. If you're looking for more information on any of these, don't hesitate to contact me. My contact information is on the last slide. So this theory of change or logic model, there are some very sophisticated theories of change. You can Google theory of change, the logic model. More often than not, I'm hearing it called the theory of change. So, how does change happen? And how does change happen? How do we get from our need to our outcome? So it's basically saying, based on research, we recognize that people are more likely to do better at their cancer treatments if they can actually get to the treatment. A number of people can't get to their treatments because the transportation is not available. And we have research that shows these different things. So identified need, research shows how to solve this need. We have input to meet the need and to fulfill the research. We work with these inputs. We get volunteers. We get donations for gas. Our outputs are the number of appointments, but our outcome is a higher survival rate. This is a fairly basic example, but if you find that you're stuck, a lot of times this is the example that we have in our head, but I would encourage you to schedule it out. So basically you're drawing your logic model out, and then you're making sure that at every step in your logic model, you have some sort of metric or numbers assigned to it. And where you don't, you're going to be thinking, okay, how do we get that information so that we make sure that what we're doing really meets our need? As far as our takeaways, you're going to look at the story your numbers are telling you. You're going to write the story that you want to read. You're making connections with your action. And you're going to share the story with your people so they can celebrate your successes or make modifications as needed. And you're going to repeat. So let's open up for questions.
Great, thank you. We do have a fair amount of folks still on the line, which is awesome. So instead of opening up the line, what I'm going to do is broadcast in the lower left-hand corner the instructions on how to unmute yourself. So if you could just press *7. Oh, actually, we have a fair amount of people who are on the computer. So maybe we can try unmuting all.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay, is there anybody who has any questions? All right, and then I think I just do have sort of one quick question, I guess, is I'm going to go ahead and mute all the lines just because I'm hearing some feedback.
The conference has been muted.
So with my question sort of is with these action and targets, while you've broken it down into 2 quarters, I guess what is sort of the realistic maybe measure for how far out? I know that I've heard in some nonprofit management, especially with these goals and strategic planning, should it be 18 months? Should it be 1 year? Should it be 3 years? Like at what point do you start getting to a tipping point where it's just a little too far out, where you really can't, it's no longer strategically valuable in the short term? Do you understand what I'm saying? Oh, Cindy, I need you to unmute yourself by pressing *7. Cindy?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. That's a great question. And it, as far as setting your goals, I would set them for the year and then the quarter. Depending on the goal, you might need to go monthly. So let me go back to a goal example. So in all of our examples, we set annual goals, and then we set monthly goals. We set annual goals, and then we broke them down into quarters. Depending on what you're deciding to do, you might end up measuring that more frequently on monthly. But what a lot of times people find is that a month is too short, so you really don't see the results for a quarter. So in many cases, people tend to go with the quarterly. The flip side, though, is if you have a really scary situation where you're losing cash fast, you might have to look at monthly or even weekly. So it will vary. I will say that in the examples that I've given, kind of with setting a yearly goal and then breaking down to quarters would be perhaps the average, but you can stretch that out or you can make that more frequent depending on your specific objective.
Okay, so we are a little bit over, but there is one question, so we'll have that be our last question, and then we'll sign off. So the question is from April, and it says, how much time, percentage-wise, do organizations usually spend planning and collecting data?
Oh, that's a good question, because doesn't this really weigh heavy on you as far as, how in the world will you do this? Once organizations get going, they find that this is just integrated into their processes, so it's really not like an add-on to what they're doing. When you start this, you might find that, perhaps you're carving out, 2 hours a week to try to get this going, and you might spend 2 hours a week to try to get this going, and it might take 3 months of that. And in your real lives, I realize that there's a number of weeks you just don't have that time. However, I will tell you, and anybody that does data and has done this process will tell you that when it works really well, and it ends up saving you time and really empowering your team because they can see where you're being successful. When I talk about your 2 hours a week or maybe 1 hour a week, just pick one thing to start with, because I do understand that for some of you who aren't doing this at all, it can seem very overwhelming. So just pick one goal, one action item, start measuring, and then gradually over time you'll start incorporating this into your everyday so that instead of saying, oh, now we're taking time out to measure, it becomes part of your routine. Not an easy process. I definitely understand that. When we talk about measuring in data, there's all different systems that you might use, whether it's QuickBooks or programs specific to what you do, like counting systems that they have you use. But thank you, April. That's a really good question.
All right, and with that, I am going to bring this webinar to a close. I want to thank Cindy yet again for lending her expertise, and this was a really, really great presentation. We hope that all of you will join us for our legislative briefing on the 26th and our next webinar on October 16th, I believe. And of course, in case you haven't seen the Power Mails, registration for our annual Homes Within Reach conference is open, so we encourage you to sign up for that as well. Again, thank you, and you all have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.